All right, everybody, we ready to get started? Okay, like I mentioned this morning, going to kind of go back in the roots of where I got started in variable rate irrigation. Um, a lot of this is going to be where we started back in crop metrics with some of our original stuff and the premise behind why we do VRI. There's going to be two sessions on this week, and tomorrow I'm going to discuss more kind of the software feature button clicks and how to do VRI using the current software. But today we're going to really focus on and do a deep dive on the agronomy and the why behind the VRI in general. So I always like to start with this. What kind of opened my eyes and why I went down the path of developing the first VRI software was when I first started doing EC mapping, or electrical conductivity, also known as EM mapping, on my own farm. And when you look at that in-depth soil texture or soil type map there on the left, that blue is indicating a heavier soil type, and the red is indicating a lighter soil type. Well, I kept getting consistent, not only aerial images like you see down below, but also yield maps that often started to align very well with the EM soil map. At the same time, I was really starting to do a lot more variable rate fertilizer and variable rate seeding on my farm. Well, nothing I did with variable rate seeding or variable rate fertilizer ever came back and correlated well with my yield maps. And it was like a dog chasing his tail in a circle. No matter how much I varied or why I varied, nothing really came back. But then I started to identify, once we started EM mapping, I could finally start directing some correlation to our yield maps and our in-season imagery, more to soil type. Well, in this case, does anybody have any idea why this was happening? Overwatering. So even though I'm varying the rate of fertilizer, variable rate in the seed, just like everybody was telling us what to do, I was overwatering and hurting my yields in those heavier soil types, going around with one flat rate of water. So industry practice is going around with one flat rate of water. So when we started looking at that from a yield perspective, and this is real data, but this is also one of the most common things that I often saw as they started working with growers all over the country. But what this is showing us is yield by management zone. So number one is that lightest soil type. Management zone is number one, the lightest soil type. Number 5 or 6 down there is going to be the heaviest soil type. Well, obviously, what are we seeing? Just like what we saw in that aerial image, there's a very direct correlation and trend downward. The lightest soil type is the most productive. The heaviest soil type is the least productive. But in reality, I know because of that texture of that soil and the component and the composition of that soil, the heaviest soil probably has the highest yield potential, in theory. So again, by applying one rate of water around that center pivot, I was just gradually decreasing the yield on each one of those soil types as they got heavier. But what was more important with understanding this is that green line. That green line is the number of acres in each one of those zones. You'll see where that green line peaks. That's indicating the zone with the most acres in the field, or what we like to determine as the majority soil type, or the majority acre. Well, that gap between that yield of 237 and that peak of my acres is showing me my opportunity. Because the greatest opportunity you have in a field is to maximize the majority acre or the majority soil type. No matter if you're focusing on irrigation, seed, or fertilizer. If you want to focus on profitability, you have to maximize that majority soil type. And I'm going to show you why here with the dollars and cents here shortly. So by adding a probe in that majority soil type, I started to water by that majority soil type. which if I take a step back, why this is so common is because when do growers typically water without a soil moisture probe? When they see the first sign of stress, which the first sign of stress is either going to come on that hillside, like he said, or on the lightest soil type. As soon as they see that stress, they're going to start that watering process. Well, that doesn't do much good if that lightest soil type is a minority acre in that field. So now if we look at it, if we start watering for that majority soil type, we start to do a shift with those yields. Those yields start to maximize in that majority acre or that management zone that has our majority soil type. Now, when we do that, we're going to lose some yield on that zone number 1 and 2. But again, if you look at it based on the number of acres in each one of those zones, that's a minimal loss for the amount we're gaining in that majority soil type. In this particular field, that was over an $8,000 gain and $62 an acre average across that whole field. So that's an average. So that takes into account however much we lost in zones 1 and 2, but the amount we gained was well over $100 an acre in that majority acre. Only a 9% improvement. Again, you heard me talk this morning about the ROI on just yield improvement. We often see 5 to 20% yield improvement from using a moisture probe alone. If you also recall that ROI slide that I showed, that accounted for $60 an acre total ROI for using a soil moisture probe, but that was also taking into account our water savings. This is just $60 an acre alone on yield, not even accounting for the water savings. Just a simple improvement on yield. And this is real data. I'm going to show you a bunch of examples like this. But then what does it look like? So we know we can improve yield on that majority soil type if we water for when that soil moisture probe's telling us. But what if we started shifting yields up in every one of those zones? And so this was the premise behind variable rate irrigation. Now let's water for each one of those zones and try to maximize productivity in each one of them. In this example, now we take that 9% to a 15% overall field improvement. Now we get to that over $100 an acre. And this is using $4.50 corn as an example. But this is real and it's attainable. Again, like I said earlier this morning in those ROI examples, this isn't made up marketing stuff. I mean, this comes straight from my own farm, and I've seen it work all across the country. I mean, it's how much overwatering typically plays into effect on actual yield productivity. So the first step in this is, as I just showed you those management zones, is we have to identify the variables in the field. We have to understand what those variables are that are affecting yield first and foremost. And this is, in this example, this is just showing EC or electrical conductivity maps by several fields next to each other. Well, you can see very quickly that the variability is not the same from field to field. We know that. But at the same time, with publicly NRCS Sergo maps, we're never going to be able to identify the level of detail or the amount of variability that's truly out in that field either. So we got to take it to the next level and do some sort of variability identification. But ultimately, what we're after is this theory called spatial irrigation optimization. And this term and this theory was originally started by, I think it was University of Mississippi years ago, but never really taken to the next factor with implementation of variable rate irrigation. But what this means is what field variability ultimately is telling us is it's identifying the potential for an area to represent perfect conditions. Obviously, what that means is if we look at the dark green spots in this yield map, that is going to be our perfect condition for that season, our highest yield in that particular season. So what we want to try to do with optimization is we want to try to transfer those perfect areas into a larger portion of the field. So everywhere that it's red and yellow, we're going to try to improve those areas with using the correct amount of irrigation. And in theory, the correct rate of water is going to equal the highest yield. Any change from that correct rate of water, whether it's too much or too little, is going to create a deviation of our yield. And ultimately, that's what creates most of our yield variability within a field to start with. Just an example of in season, kind of using some of our old soil moisture probes, but you can clearly see two different distinct soil types are going to require two distinct different amount of water. So going back to, we have to identify that variability. Well, what influences variability, yield variability each year? We have our soil chemistry. You know, a lot of the growers are probably grid or smart zone sampling today, and they're accounting for their nutrient variability through variable rate fertilizer applications. Nothing of that is going to relate back to water in particular. We have our temporal variability. Well, we can't control that. You know, the seasonal, year-to-year seasonal conditions and cropping practices aren't out of our control. But there's two things that I call the fixed factors, and we talked a little bit, Nick Stoll and Rebecca talked a little bit about that this morning, but it's soil type and topography. And I often narrow it down to landscape change. So landscape change, if you take a raw elevation map, for example, the raw elevation map doesn't necessarily correlate to yield specifically. But it's that landscape change where you break down that elevation map into the highs and the lows of that field that really drives yield. Obviously, our hilltops where we're going to have more water runoff, or our depressions where we're going to be carrying more water throughout the season. Both of these are directly related to water, our water holding capacity. And that's what we want to try and identify to start with on a variable rate application. So there's several different ways to go about this. That image I showed this morning with the CropX Hummer, what they're actually pulling behind them is a SWOT map, or a SWOT mapping system. What the underlying technology of this is electrical conductivity mapping. And you'll see on that first bullet point, I reference electrical magnetic or EC mapping, which is one of the same things. Originally, when we got started, there was two main sensors out there that did the majority of this type of mapping, dual EM and EM38, both sensors out of Canada. Fairly old technology now, not the most automated when it comes to field mapping. SWOT Maps is the next generation of that. They basically took that and built software on top of it to provide an EC mapping system. Another common one out there is Veris Maps. Veris was kind of one of the leaders in driving the importance of EC mapping back in the day. And they have several versions of Veris rigs today to be able to go out there and do this. One that I personally have been using for the last couple of years is Agronomy 365 Baseline RX program. They have taken it to a whole nother level where now they use satellite imagery to create their EC maps. Along with that, they combine that with LiDAR mapping. So it's a fully automated system that you don't even have to go out to the field to do anymore. And it creates its EC map that's got 99% accuracy of an actual field map system. Other newer systems, not familiar with, but I was just going to list them out here, is Earth Optics and Pattern Ag, a very in-depth mapping process. And then a very new one is this LandScan digital soil map. But I want to list all those out there just so everybody, if interested, had kind of what options are available to kind of get started with EC and EM mapping. But from there, once we have the maps, we're going to drive that back to that yield productivity and that yield variability, like I said. And then this goes into advanced analysis software. And you're primarily going to be looking at those two core components, your soil type with the EC maps and your topography with either LiDAR or RTK elevation broken up. And you can relate that back to your yield maps to see what level or what extent of variability really occurs out there. Obviously, if you have a low amount of variability in your yield maps, VRI probably isn't a fit. If you have an extreme amount or a large amount of variability, VRI is going to be a major opportunity when it relates to both topography and or soil type. I looked through, was trying to give examples of good software programs that do this today. And I'm sad to say there isn't any out there that do this very automated or very easily. The programs that we were using back when we first started were desktop programs, which I can name a few. Some of them aren't even alive yet today. Software programs aren't alive. Working with our software team, I did get the approval that we are now going to start building this advanced yield analysis in our system, and we think we can do that fairly quickly. So I'm hoping yet this year, and if not by growing season, we'll be able to provide you guys with some of these tools to be able to analyze your yield data and identify this variability for the growers to then seamlessly bring it into the VRI process. Great question. So the question was, how often do we have to run the EC map? The EC map is a one-time mapping process, and it's good for the life of the field. That question came up this morning. How much does soil type and soil textural change? And like John Gates said, it's minimal, very, very minimal. Unless you're doing any major dirt work or stuff like that, it's a one-time mapping cost. And so generally, and that's another just for your guys as dealer, usually grower cost with that EC mapping runs anywhere from $5 to $10 an acre. So it's a one-time cost, and then they get that data for their lifetime. And the nice thing is you can use that for everything. As long as, it's not only directly correlated with water holding capacity, but you can use that for seeding and nitrogen and everything. And that's the beauty behind VRI. When I gave you my first example on my own farm, and I said I was doing all the other variable rate practices. Well, the first thing you should always start with is water. Maximize and optimize your water efficiency on every one of those zones. And then from there, then you can start piggybacking with other VRA technologies such as seeding and nitrogen and really start to push your yields to the next level. Yes, good question. When we look at developing that optimal VRI prescription, and this is where I'm going to kind of dive into the nuts and bolts so you guys understand the reasoning behind how to do the prescription process. But the question always comes up, is my goal increasing yield, or is it reducing my water, improving my water use efficiency? Ultimately, it's probably a combination of both, but profitability is always number one for that grower. As we just talked, we got to develop some consistent management zones, whether that's EC data, soil type, or your topography. Anybody know why yield data isn't a good reason to start with when we start to develop some of our management zones? It's probably the most common practice because it's the most readily available data set. And we've got great partners like John Deere and Case with their wireless data transfer make the data more readily available than it ever used to be. But as we know, that yield map can be affected by so many different factors throughout the season. Whether it is fertility issues, whether it's hybrid issues, insect, disease, whatever it may be, the variability driven and shown in yield maps is not directly correlated to what we want to develop our prescriptions off of. There's just too many variables from season to season. So that's why we want to start with these more consistent factors. Yeah, and so what Preston was saying, when we start with the yield maps, we're only assuming what's driving that variability in the yield maps. Until we get to a good software program with, like I said, I'm very excited to start working on this. But ideally, this new software is going to be able to analyze our yield by any other data set you have in the program. So your seeding, your hybrids, your soil type, your topography. And I can promise you year after year that there's going to be more correlation and consistency that comes back with those yield maps to your high quality EC maps and your topography than there will be any of those other variables. But yes, that's why we're starting there. The basic of agronomy, of understanding water holding capacity in each one of those zones. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about that. How do we go from EC and topography to actual water holding capacity to know how much I can and should vary my water as that pivot goes around? Probably one of the number one things is, no one size fits all. So what I do on one field may only work on that one field. You got to be, and it might work on the next 20 fields. But you got to be prepared to understand each field and treat it individually. And most importantly, then let the probe be the guide. The probe is still going to drive our what I refer to as the base rate. And going back to those yield graphs, that probe made the biggest jump in our profitability, maximizing that majority soil type. That probe is going to drive when to irrigate and how much to irrigate in our majority soil type. And then we're just going to adjust on those extreme ends. So creating the VRI prescription, just looking at it from inside the CropX platform here. Again, we're starting with the management zones. We've made it very simple to go in there and develop management zones, whether you want to use them for any variable rate application process or VRI specifically. But in there, when we get to the soil type map, we actually have two options. We have a based on sensor, we have a full point irrigation for each zone and an optimized water strategy for each zone. And I just wanted to stop here and I want to dive into those two here in a little bit to explain what each of those two options truly mean. So the full point means we're going to water each zone to maximize their water holding capacity in each zone. It ensures that the higher water holding capacities water receives more water. So those heavier soil types are going to receive more water because they have a larger bucket to hold. On the flip end, we're going to cut back on our lighter soil types. Whereas the optimized water uptake strategy is the complete opposite. This is where we're going to focus on optimization across the entire fields. And this is typically what we use in my area back in Nebraska, where we're going to put on less water in those heavier soil types. Because that's where we start to see more of the detriment is when you're putting on one flat rate of water, those heavier soil types are often getting overwatered the most. So we're going to cut back water on the heavier soil types and put on more water in those lighter soil types. Does that make sense? Both of those two scenarios. I'm going to touch on that on one of the watchouts. It's a good call out. So if we have a very dry start to the season, will this hurt us getting started? Yes and no. The key point with that is we're still going to use that soil moisture probe as our guide. But there are some watchouts in those type of scenarios when we're starting off with a very dry season or following a very dry season. And I've got that in an upcoming slide on our watchout. So very good point. The other option is we can just go in there and manually place our rates. We don't have to select either one of those last two options and let it be automated, where that would automatically place in some rates for us. But instead, we can just set our rates for each zone. Again, this is where it's important to understand the water holding capacity in each one of our management zones. Understand how our management zones were derived. Again, whether it's from topography, EC, or a combination of, and then go and adjust our application rates based on the water holding capacity in each one of those zones. And so this was the best way I could try to do that. We all know those water holding capacities vary by soil type. Ultimately, what we're going to do is identify that majority soil type, right? That's where our probe is located. Well, in this example, let's say we have the probe located in the highlighted zone, which is sandy clay loam with a 3-foot profile of water holding capacity of 5.4 inches. From there, we're just adjusting based on a percentage from that base zone. So again, often I think some of the challenges when trying to determine these VRI rates, we often overthink it on how much can I cut back or how much more should I put on. But it's really just a percentage from the base. And this shows you an example of both the full point optimization strategy and then the optimized strategy where we can either put on more or less based on either one of those strategies. Any questions with this? And again, this will all be available after the conference that you guys can reference as you start to get working on your own prescriptions also. And here's an example of both those strategies, the full point and the optimize. And basically you can just see they are an inverse of one or the other. Like I said, the standard crop metrics way of doing it, how we first got started, was the optimized water strategy on the right. But we developed the full point irrigation strategy for crop X, as this is probably used more internationally, watering for the amount the bucket that can hold in terms of water holding capacity. From there, there's several different options. Again, no one size fits all. We can just go with that base prescription and water all season long, or we can get unique and water for different scenarios throughout the year. We've probably hit on it before, but if you're not aware, we have a wiper feature built into the software that will simply speed up and slow down coming out at each of the corners so you don't double apply with those wiper scenarios. We have an example there of landscape changes, the topography change, creating a prescription just based on topography. Down in the left corner, this was a unique one, but I was surprised on how much this took off. We're in really light soils, central and western Nebraska. Many times when they do get a rain throughout the year, they can't stop that pivot. They got to keep that pivot going, otherwise those lighter soils are going to burn up. Well, before we had variable rate irrigation, they were simply overwatering everything else just because they knew they had to water because 1/3 of the field was that lighter soil type. Well, this was very simple, what we call the rain prescription, where they just flipped on the rain prescription, sped across the entire field till they got to those lighter soil types. The nice thing with this is the new controllers today, what we always call the telemetry devices on the center pivots. They can store up to 10 prescriptions, kind of standard. They might even be more now, Jake. I don't know where you guys are at. But so you can store 10 different prescriptions and name them individually. So in any type of different scenario, you can quickly swap over and change a prescription if needed for that grower. So let's look at some of the results. This was kind of supposed to be an animation, but that's all right. The circled area on the left, you can see that red zone. So this was the first 2 years. The first year before VRI. This was a customer in that circled area in the upper left corner was a heavier soil area zone, but that pivot got stuck 8 times that year. And he said that was just average. And this was a very large grower and had pivots all over. And he had a whole crew of 4 or 5 guys that basically chased pivots all summer long just to pull them out when they got stuck. And just from that 1 year, you can see in that picture on the right how much we just decreased that red zone. Now, did we just decrease it 100%? No. But we achieved, number one, the first objective. That pivot didn't get stuck that year. And just the amount of labor and maintenance from those pivots not getting stuck was a huge improvement everywhere aside from yield. And I can't remember, I think the yield improvement overall just for that 10 acres, I think he improved like over $3,500. So again, it paid for the cost of the probe and the VRI just from that one zone alone. Now the other thing that I have highlighted is that black triangle kind of on the west half of the pivot. Now why I identified that is because if you look at the two yield maps on top, in year 2, we actually went down in yield. And the reason I highlight this is because every year is a learning experience, and you might not get it absolutely perfect. In this specific example, we probably got too aggressive and put on too much water. We were actually putting on more water in that lighter soil type, where we actually were putting on just enough that it was too much and we overwatered that lighter soil type. Again, easy change. But I wanted to point that out, that even through all the successes, there's always going to be additional room for opportunity that you can sit down with that grower, evaluate how it worked, and tweak that prescription for the coming year. Here's an example of soybean yield. I showed that PTI proven results where they showed $280 improvement on soybeans. Here's a real example of year 1 and 2. But the reason why I want to point this out is this also aligns very well with those first yield analysis graphs I showed you, where it trends from high to low, going from lighter soil type to heavier soil type. So just like in that corn crop example, we're seeing the same effect in soybeans. And this is probably more noticeable. You guys are probably all well aware how much water affects soybeans more in those heavier soil types. But in the 2 previous years, you can see we had an 11% and a 17% loss just in those last 2 zones, just in the 2 heavier soil type zones. Well, after VRI, we cut back, we reduced our water application by 14%, and we improved yield by 7 bushel an acre, which equated to $84 an acre just in those 2 zones. And I thought I had one more pop-up. The reason why I showed that was sometimes you're not going to see a yield improvement on every soil type or every zone. But in this particular example, the cost of improvement on just those 2 heavier soil types, again, paid for the moisture probe, paid for the VRI itself on a minimum amount of acres. Another example, a big difference in zone 1 and 2, where in these examples we had nearly 2-year average of 47 bushel difference. Obviously a lighter soil type, a ridge top. In just 12 acres alone, we were able to improve that over $2,000. And what we did in this zone was we not only implemented VRI, but we also combined with seeding and nitrogen and increased that with a 36 bushel yield improvement. So again, it's sometimes not the focus of the entire field. The entire field, we're going to focus on that majority soil type with our soil moisture probe, maximize productivity in that majority soil type. But VRI, the magic behind VRI are going to be those extremes, the lighter and the heavier end of that majority soil type. That's where we want to focus on. So back when we first got started, we had to find a way to show the value in this. I just showed you a couple basic examples with just basic yield analysis, but how could we implement a field trial? And this kind of reminded me of one of Jake's images here when he showed you the mechanical differences of the pivot and the variation in the yield. Well, I told Nick Stoll back there he must have been running a 30-30 trial. And what we started to implement was a 30-30 trial with all the growers where we would rotate every 30 degrees with the grower's legacy rate of a flat rate to the VRI rate. And then we came back and analyzed the yield data in each one of those zones with the VRI versus the flat rate. In this particular example, we also had moisture probes in each zones. We had 2 moisture probes in the heavier zone, in the VRI and the flat, and then the same in the light zone, 1 in the VRI and the flat. But it really started to open our eyes when we started looking at that soil moisture probe data too, telling us that we were doing the right thing. So this is the flat rate zone. When we look at the variable rate irrigation zone, where we're cutting back water on that heavier soil type, what do we see? You know, in that flat rate zone, we see very little activity past the 12 inches. And in fact, very little activity in the 12 inches alone. But when you look down at the variable rate irrigation, all the way down to 36 inches, we're getting rooting activity and water implementation. So we can see a direct effect that we're getting close to that right rate. A huge savings on water and a huge improvement in crop health and overall productivity. So let's look at yield. Yield in the lightest soil type in one of the 30 by 30 trials, 25 bushel an acre response, just in that one zone. So again, often when we get asked, well, how much is VRI going to help from a yield perspective? And I said, it's a wide range. You know, if you look at it across your entire field, the average might only be 5 to 8 bushel increase across the whole field. But let's focus on those zones that we're really targeting. In this example, 25 bushel increase on the lighter soil type. Another example in that same field, when we look at the heaviest soil type, by cutting back 1/4 of an inch, we're increasing the yield by another 25 bushel. So again, both those extremes, we're hitting them from both angles. Another thing that we worked with Nick Lammers on, with the 30-30 trials, we started to implement variety trials across these 30-30 irrigation trials. Our goal, we were working with Monsanto and we wanted to try to identify, was there any hybrid response to water use efficiency? The cool thing here, you can see along the bottom a whole list of different hybrids. The cool thing was every single one of them responded to variable rate irrigation, had an improvement across the field with VRI. But what the neat thing is if you look at each one of those hybrids, and the difference between the 2 blue bars is they vary by the extent of improvement. And this really shows you how every hybrid may not react the same, and why we have to treat, again, each field individually. There's different impacts by each one of these different hybrids. Some are going to respond better than others. But in this case, this particular year, each one of those hybrids had a positive effect. So the VRI watchouts. Do we have a question?
Few questions here. First one is, can we easily get these prescriptions transferred over to the pivot controllers?
Yep, so question is, can we easily transfer these prescriptions over to the pivot controllers? The way the CropX system works today, we have a standard CSV export, which can be imported into any pivot telemetry. And then we have a direct API with the Ranke telemetry that can do a seamless export right from the web.
Second question here is VRI prescription something you do and offer to a grower, or just something you educate the growers on and help them make their own? Asking because of liability on improper prescriptions.
So interesting question. Is the prescription something you do yourself as a service or train the growers to do themselves because of liability? In my case, liability was never really came into a factor. Yes, there is some risk, but there's a risk with every variable rate technology. Like we said, seeding, fertilizer, whatever it may be. There's a risk in placing a soil moisture probe and potentially giving them the wrong advice there. But again, through proper training, you got to have the confidence that you're going in there and helping that grower and educating them along the way. So typically, this is a service opportunity for the dealer. And I was just talking about this with another dealer right before I started. And it varies. We have some dealers that are charging per acre fee, and we have some dealers just charging a flat rate fee for the prescription service. And that varies from $2 to $4 an acre. And then on the flat rate, probably varies from 100 to, $500 per field with an average of $250 per field average, I'd say. All right, I'll keep going and we can hit more of those questions when I finish up here. So there are some watch outs. It's not a perfect, and someone had already brought this up, starting the season in dry conditions. This is probably one of the biggest challenges with VRI. When we first got started, VRI was really humming. It was really working. We had wet springs, wet falls. We were seeing the immediate impact for the first couple seasons. Then we went into a drought. We went into a drought for 2 years. Well, the growers were so excited, they kept running those VRI prescriptions coming into those drought years. Well, what happened was when we started cutting back water on those heavier soil types, we forgot about how much water that crop was using in that VT in those R1 stages. That crop was actually pulling out more water than we were replenishing by the time the pivot could get around in 5 or 6 days. We were always chasing the dragons. We actually hurt ourselves coming off a dry year and during the dry year. That's why I put up this water use chart again, that we have to remember how much water that crop is using. And in those instances, what we found is VRI will typically work best early in the season and later in the season. But when you get into peak water use, you're typically going to go to flat rate because you can only put on that 1/4 an inch, 4/10 of an inch at the most by that time that pivot gets around each turn of the circle. So we got to be mindful of how much that crop is using during the peak of that reproductive season. Don't cut it short, but utilize VRI early and late is going to be your biggest opportunity. And like I said earlier, no one size fits all. And that really kind of sums it up. I started with this slide earlier today, said it was the slide that I always used to start presentations with. And when we talk about VRI, it really brings it to, the full circle. And now we're not only a systems approach, but we're an integrated systems approach. We're integrating with the other technologies we already have available, such as the pivot controller. We had that question about how do we upload to the pivot controller. Any pivot with pivot telemetry today, no matter what the brand is capable of doing variable rate irrigation. So, Jake, you got a percentage of how many pivots have telemetry today? Do we have any idea? Correct. And there are panels that do it as well. I was referencing just from the fact that telemetry has grown so much over the last couple of years, it's probably 50 or 60% of the pivots on the market. But either way, as Jake said, there's some of the pivot controllers are also capable of doing it. Preston. You mean nozzle to nozzle? Yeah. Yep. Good question. Sector or speed control. And maybe I should have clarified that from the beginning. That was the other thing. When we first started this, kind of created such a buzz. People wanted to run to that next step. Next thing they wanted to talk about was nozzle control. And we started testing nozzle control. The cost of nozzle control back then was extreme. It was a $40,000-$50,000 upgrade back then. I don't know what it would even be today, but it was tough to justify that cost compared to the level of improvement we could do with variable rate speed control. In fact, at that time, really all the companies that were doing variable rate zone control, none of them have advanced their zone control capabilities from what they had back 10 years ago. And, they might be working on something new, but nothing has been released yet as of today. So it kind of shows you the importance or the reliance on the variable rate speed control. But then, Correct. Well, and going back to those earlier studies, and so, and it's a great example. I'm glad you're bringing it up because we often heard this from growers, you know, especially when they're used to their planters being able to go row by row, their sprayers going row by row. Everything's row by row today. The challenge was, again, the cost to justify nozzle control VRI is not there compared to the amount and the ROI that is there for variable speed control. And you would be surprised when you break down an actual zone control or a nozzle control prescription versus a speed control prescription, how much that speed control is actually helping. You know, and another good point I'll bring up when I talked about that majority soil type and maximizing that majority soil type across the entire field, and you saw the level of improvement, yield improvement that we can impact. Ultimately, what we're doing with sector or speed control is now we're identifying the majority zone or the majority acre in each one of those individual pie slices, and we're watering for that majority zone. So now we're maximizing each one of those little 6 degree, 2 degree, whatever it may be, pie slices and creating yep, going based off that base percentage from the majority soil type of the field. So again, now we're using the probe. We can really focus on the right amount at the right timing. And with VRI, we can take it to the next level with right locations. So lastly, I just wanted to show a little glimpse of some work that John Gates and I worked on that is kind of still in the back burner, but wanted to show you a vision of kind of what's possible and what we're capable of doing with VRI. And it's what we called the adaptive VRI. And hopefully this works. And if you watch this time series, this was taken in real-time data from both weather and soil moisture probe and was automatically changing this pivot on the go. We had it directly integrated with the pivot controller, and we are adjusting this pivot speed on the go based on real-time conditions. So we called it adaptive VRI because now it started with your base layer prescription, but from there, it was automatically adjusting throughout the season. So really cool stuff. Hopefully we'll be playing with it again here in the future. Correct. Well, and that's a good question. So there's a couple different approaches. The question was, if we're fertigating, should we be using full point or optimized prescription? In most cases, if I was fertigating, I would be going flat rate irrigation and focus on putting a flat rate of fertilizer out to make sure we're getting, if I'm going to vary my rate of fertilizer, I wouldn't be focused on the water holding capacity as much as my nutrient capabilities in each one of those zones and adjusting it almost. It may in turn end up being the same zones, but your speeds are going to be different based on the yield potential and the nitrogen content that you're putting out there. That makes sense? What's that? Somebody else say something? Great question. So the question is, could we give some visualization in our graphs indicating how much water that crop ultimately would be using, whether it's based on crop growth stage or GDD? And I'm going to save that one for tomorrow because we have that slide coming in the new product and release. So yes, something fun coming. Yep. great question. Again, use the agronomist answer. It depends. But in theory, yes, it's great to make multiple prescriptions so you're ready to attack the different situations or scenarios you might encounter throughout the year. I'll give you another great example on one that I use on my own farm on a particular field. So we use the optimized strategy where we're putting on less water on the heavier soil type, more water on the lightest soil type. Well, the challenge with that is you can only put so much on that lighter soil type. It can only hold so much, right? So that if we try to put on 2 inches like it probably needs, it's just going to be going straight through that sand profile and potentially leaching everything away. So the one other thing that we've done is when we get to those zones, we call it a triple wiper prescription, where it will actually cut back to a 1/2 inch. It'll go across that sand zone, stop, come back, go across that sand zone, stop again, and then come back and proceed on with the rest of the field. And you could do that at each one of those sand zones. When you're going that fast, it doesn't take any more time. But so essentially what it did was it put on a 1/2 inch at, hours apart, split apart 12 hours, 3 different times. It got a total of 1.5 inches, but it didn't get a total of 1.5 inches all at one time. That would have ran all off or just pushed everything through that profile. So we kind of call that the triple wiper, but something other to consider on those lighter soil types. That works very well. Jake. And high slopes, yep. Another good example for high slopes, like Jake said, where we've got the potential for that runoff. It works very well in those slope positions. Yep. So if we look at this pivot up in the upper left, there's my marker. So let's say this is a sand zone. You can set the controller. So typically when we do that optimized water strategy, it's going to put on less water on the heavier soil types, more water on the lighter soil types. Well, that prescription might come out saying we need 1.5 inches or 2 inches on that lighter soil type. But whether it's a slope or a lighter soil type, we know that that zone can't handle it all at once. So we can actually set the prescription at a 1/2 inch, and then within the controller, we can set the controller to, as it's going around its normal path, it'll go across this sand zone, stop here, come back, apply it to 1/2 inch again, stop here, and then start again and continue on with the rest of the field. So all in one pass, it just did an application of a 1/2 inch 3 times, but it was split apart about 12 hours, that it's just enough that it lets that soil dry out and accumulate that water more effectively. Works really well. Scott. Yep. Yep. So the question is, and it kind of piggybacks on what Preston was talking about earlier, but when we get into these sectors, again, growers are always worried about multiple soil zones or multiple zones within each one of those sectors. So he asked if in one of the next software versions, if we could identify what the percentage of each management zone was in the sector so that the grower can better understand from a grower perspective why we're watering it the way we are to maximize that majority soil type. Felix. Oh, out of time. All right.